an area we're working in. While I'm thinking of it, I want to introduce a couple other folks here who are on that group as directors. Diane Koch is here and Kevin Koch is here. They're raising their hands. We're trying to recruit Dale Easley, but he hasn't said yes yet. Former faculty member here. We have a total of 8. We meet monthly. We've put on a couple years now what we call the Music, Art, and Story Fest, where we gather to celebrate the natural resources of this area, but also raise money for a land, water, and wildlife habitat fund, which we've established at the Dubuque Community Foundation. If you didn't pick it up on the way in, you can do so on the way out. There's a little postcard with 3 QR codes. One is a link to that fund. Consider a donation, maybe as the holidays approach. There's also a link to our Facebook page where we will be posting information about future activities and events. Eventually, we'll have a website, maybe a go on Instagram, because we know Facebook is kind of passé, we've heard, with the younger generation. And there's also a third QR code there. Sue Dravis is out in the back. She's also a director. She's waving. She took your names. If you didn't leave your name on the way in and your email, please do so. We don't have members. We don't charge membership dues or fees. We never will, as far as I'm concerned. Who knows how long I'm going to be around. We have what we call allies. So if you want to be an ally of our organization, which just simply means you support our mission and want to keep in touch with us and learn about what we're doing so you can contribute in whatever ways you can, become an ally. You'll get on our emailing list and you'll hear about future events like this one and what we're renaming as our Land and Water Fest, which will be about music, art, and storytelling. We think we should be more direct about who we are in that. So we're planning that for Earth Day weekend 2026. More to hear about that. But you'll get that information if you sign up to be an ally. And just very simply, our mission is to provide and support others in their research, education, advocacy, and in my view, coalition building around protecting, conserving, enhancing, and enjoying our natural resources in the Dubuque area. Very broad. We don't anticipate that we're going to be doing a lot of our own projects. We're not here to replace other groups and their missions. We're here to find ways to bring attention to them and work together with them to make things happen. We think there's a niche there that needs to be filled. We're happy to fill it, and we're very happy to partner with institutions like the University of Dubuque that really bring new blood and new ideas to our community through the students who are coming here, whether they're from Dubuque or elsewhere. We'd really love it if they could stay at least a little while when they're done, but certainly improve upon their portfolios by working in the community while they're here. And I think I can introduce a person who I think has been a champion for that as long as I've known him, the new Vice President for Academic Affairs. Mr. Hoffman is here. He was on the board of the County Board of Health for several years, overlapping with the new director's position, and he served in a capacity that allowed him to help some of the early work in this community on water quality measurement and just raising that issue within the Board of Health. Because we've heard, and I don't mean to get into long speeches, but I think it's important to know that water quality has become a very important issue of debate in this state because of its connection with the health effects, such as cancer, the cancer rates in Iowa. And that's something our other speaker will be talking about. But I'm very appreciative of Adam Hoffman's support personally over the years and his willingness to engage in the community. And I think he's going to play an important role in making sure this institution continues to connect with the community in many multifaceted ways going forward. So thanks for hosting and appreciate the assistance from our AV tech supporter in the back as well, who's making sure that we're able to live stream this event. And it'll be available on YouTube for any of your friends and colleagues who haven't had a chance to get here tonight. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Allie White is the director of the County Health Department, a role she's had since 2022. She came in the wake of the pandemic. So as many of us remember those days, county public health and other public health institutions were under a lot of pressure. We'll just leave it at that. And so her willingness to step into that role is pretty remarkable, considering she came to it from the school district where they had some of their own issues to deal with at the time. So she may not have known how much water quality was going to be part of her portfolio to deal with at the time, but I think she's boned up on a little bit, and she's here to tell us some programming that's already in place in the state of Iowa that people have been taking advantage of, can continue to take advantage of, and what some of the results and benefits of that program are. It's called the Grants to Counties Well Testing Program, and I'd like to welcome Allie to the stage now to tell us all about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? A little bit closer? Is that better? You can hear me in the back? Okay, good. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thank you to UD for hosting. I'm happy to be here tonight. My name is Allie White, and I serve as a public health director here in Dubuque County. I am proud to represent a dedicated team of 6 individuals, all professionals united by a common goal, and that is to protect and promote the health and well-being of everyone in our community. I'm joined tonight by one of our newest team members, John Sewell. John came aboard just a few weeks ago as an environmental specialist, and he, along with Bailey Evanerius, played a key role in protecting one of our most vital resources in Dubuque County, our drinking water. Together, they ensure that residents who rely on private wells, particularly in our rural areas, have access to water that is safe, clean, and reliable. Tonight, I'd like to share some updates on the private well grant program, which is a partnership with Iowa Health and Human Services. This program is a critical part of our broader effort to protect water quality and improve health outcomes in Dubuque County. The private well grant program matters to our community, primarily because many of our neighbors across the county depend on their private wells for their drinking water. Unlike public water systems, which are regularly monitored and regulated under federal law, private wells fall solely on the shoulders of individual homeowners. For anyone who owns a private well, navigating these water quality issues can be daunting. That's where the private well grant program comes in. It helps close the gap by offering essential services, such as free water testing so that homeowners may know what is in their drinking water, well reconstruction to address structural or safety concerns when needed, shock chlorination and assessments to address bacterial contamination, and proper well plugging, which can prevent abandoned wells from becoming environmental hazards. Through this program, we work to ensure that no matter your zip code or income level, that every resident has the opportunity to protect their family's health. We're proud to bring these services to Dubuque County and to be part of a statewide effort that's making a real difference, especially in some of our rural communities. So we'll talk a little bit about the impact that we've had so far. And I'm going to focus tonight's discussion primarily on fiscal year 25, which is our most recent full set of data, okay? So the private well grant program has been around in Dubuque County, predating my time here, but we figured kind of honing in on 1 year would give us kind of a clear picture. So over the past 3 years, Dubuque County Public Health has fully utilized our annual allocation of approximately $40,000 in grant funding. And in some years, the last 3 fiscal years, I believe, we have even secured additional funds to expand our services. So when other counties across the state don't use their allocation, there's a period where we can say, hey, we've tested so many wells and we've, expended 95% of our funds, so then we can get some reallocation to expand the services we offer. And those dollars go directly to where they're needed most, improving water quality to reduce health risks in our community. So in fiscal year 2025, we tested 276 private wells, our highest number yet. Of those, about 81% met all of the drinking water quality standards. But nearly 1 in 5 did have issues that required follow-up action, okay? So that was 52 wells that did not meet the water quality standards of those that we had checked. For 22 of them, we provided shock chlorination, and so that's the responsibility of the homeowner to hire someone who's certified to do that service or perform that service, but then the grant can provide reimbursement for that service. So at little to no cost to the homeowner, and we can help walk homeowners through the process. We found that, 33 wells did test positive for total coliform bacteria. So that's a common contamination indicator. It can make you sick if you drink that water, but it's one of the less challenging bacterias, I'll say. There were 2 wells that tested positive for E. coli, which is concerning because that poses a more immediate health risk. It's not uncommon for us to hear from families that say, hey, someone in my family has been sick, we've been doctoring, and the physician will say, hey, well, get your private well tested as kind of a starting point to see where some of this illness may be coming from. So we can certainly help with that. So yes, we do check for total coliform bacteria, which we see most commonly, E. coli, which we do see. We also test for nitrates in drinking water wells. So of the 276 that we tested, 25 of them had nitrate levels that were above the federal safety limits, particularly concerning for infants and pregnant women. I will say the good news is, though, that none of the wells that we tested were positive for arsenic or manganese, which can have serious long-term effects on health as well. That's not to say it's not there, it's just saying that of those that we tested, we didn't find any. So every one of these efforts not only protects individuals, homes, and families, it also safeguards our shared environment and the groundwater. So looking ahead, we don't want our work to stop here. We want to continue. We look to remain focused on providing timely and accurate testing to anybody who requests it. We want to continue to use the data to guide smarter, more targeted interventions. And so what I would say is, you'll see up here we have, I apologize, it is a little bit small, but we have it broken down primarily by zip code. And that's kind of how I should say, our first priority was to expand the testing, okay? We want to get the word out there. We want people to know that that's what we're here for. So that's kind of where our focus has been. We've used postcards and mailings and those sorts of things to try to educate the community about this resource we have available. Now that we feel like we're kind of getting some, people to partake in this and we're having more and more data, we want to be more mindful about what we're doing with that. And that means looking at things beyond probably just zip codes, okay? We want to continue to educate well owners about the risks and practical solutions, while also keeping the community informed and engaged, which is why I'm so thankful for this event and to have been invited here tonight. So we're also committed to maintaining the highest standards for our staff training and staying current with best practices in the fields. We attend conferences regularly to make sure that we're up to date on the most current information. And by looking at the bigger environmental picture, we aim to better predict, prevent, and respond to contamination risks, not just to react to them. So this is about building a smarter, more resilient system that protects public health at its roots. So thank you again to the community, to our partners at HHS, to everyone who put on the event, and most importantly, those of you who are here tonight. I know this work doesn't always make the front page and it's not glamorous, but it is important. Clean drinking water impacts each and every one of us. So in closing, I would say if you or someone you know owns a private well and would like to take advantage of this program, I did leave some postcards on the table at the back. Has our phone number to the Dubuque County Public Health Department, where we'd be more than happy to talk you through specifics of the program or get you on our list to come and test your water, and that can be done annually. So I am happy to stick around for the end of the presentation. If there's questions afterwards, I'll be around and happy to chat with you about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Allie, for that important background information and really setting the stage well for the expanded conversation we're going to have about drinking water in the Driftless. And by the way, your new hire, who answered the phone today when I called, John Sewell, is going to be a good addition because he comes to you from the Dubuque County Watersheds Project. So as we start looking at water quality in terms of watershed work, there's really some important tie-ins, and I'm sure he can be a strong link to what's already going on elsewhere in the region. Drinking water as a policy issue, many of you know I used to be in the legislature 16 years. Environmental issues, including water quality, were kind of one of my fortes. Drinking water was, I would call a niche issue within that broader universe of issues that didn't necessarily get the attention it deserved, but probably was more important than even legislators understood because it affects everyone, right? So drinking water research is something that I tried to support. Our speaker next is somebody I met really from a pantheon of research faculty and centers at the University of Iowa that I got to know over the course of 16 years that are doing really good, really strong work. Their work led me to introduce some legislation. I wish that legislation met the applause that it deserved and the passage that it deserved, but it's still out there as discussion tools. The Center for the Health Effects of Environmental Contamination, which our speaker leads, was really a primary source for some of that data and researched background that any good legislator or any good legislation should have before it's introduced. So I'm really happy that I've been able to work with David in the legislature, but also outside of it today. As the promotion for this event indicated, he's the director of the Center for the Health Effects of Environmental Contamination at the university. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering and a research engineer at IIHR, the Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa. I understand he also has a lot of chemistry students he's teaching right now, and that's in his background as well. CHEEC was established through the 1987 Groundwater Protection Act. I was on a phone call today with two of the architects of that act who want to start talking about how did we do it and why can't we do that again? So that's a conversation for the future. Maybe we'll have those two gentlemen here in the future. But the primary activity involves maintaining databases for environmental health research. They're involved in a variety of epidemiological studies of rural and urban populations in Iowa, mainly focused on, as I said, on drinking water contaminants and health effects. But his CV is so long, I had to summarize it in 2 pages. He's led several, I found this fascinating, several public health initiatives, including the Iowa Get the Lead Out water testing program, which I have to confess I had not heard much about, but it's a cool name. And the public data platforms like Iowa Trust Your Tap and the Iowa Well Forecasting System. Most importantly, he's been recognized by his peers. He was recognized by the University of Iowa with the Michael J. Brody Award for Faculty Excellence in Service, and I'm sure part of that service is being willing to come out and speak to communities like ours. Welcome, Dr. Cwiertny.
I'm going to use this one, if that's okay. This one's on, or no? Can you hear me now? Ooh, yes. Give me one moment. I'm a bit of a wanderer. How about this? Is that good? Awesome. Okay, and then we got an advancer. Good. And one final question, since I'm difficult. The person recording, can I walk down there, or do I need to be up here? Oh, great. Okay, because like I said, I'm a wanderer and stairs scare me. And I realize that's far. So I will do my best to sort of point out the things that matter most. First, plenty of thanks to Casey for hosting me at the University of Dubuque. We had a wonderful exchange with students today. It was fantastic. To Adam for his partnership. Where is he? Ah, there he is. Thank you. You'll see some work that we did with Adam. We care about Dubuque for a lot of reasons, but it's not great people, which helps. To Chuck, we've gone back a ways, and he's wanted to work with us, and I'm constantly reminding him that getting good data and good science takes time. So I'm glad that I'm finally here to deliver on the promise to share back with you what we've been learning. And I think you'll see why it's taken some time. And to Director White, we can't do this sort of work without support of counties and county health officials, because you'd be surprised. A lot of folks find us as a nuisance because we're in their county testing their water, but Dubuque has always been very supportive, and so thank you so much for that. You did my work for me, Chuck. I don't have to talk about it. We were founded back in 1987 through the Groundwater Protection Act. I always tell people that was a different time in Iowa. That's how we aren't doing this today, because it's just a different state these days. But we're a multidisciplinary environmental health research center. We support and conduct research to really look at these links between environmental contamination and public health. And as Chuck was saying earlier, there's just so much conversation today about water quality, environmental quality, and public health in Iowa, and particularly the concerns over our very high cancer rate. We'll talk a little bit about that and try to put some data behind it. I'm here to talk about private wells because that's just what we've been known for. So the previous director at Cheek I took over in 2017. Was Pete Wire with Gene Parkin, who is the faculty director, and they led things like the Iowa statewide rural well water survey, which gave us some of the first really good data. That's back before the private well grant program had really been founded or set up, right? And so Cheek has kind of got its roots in private wells, and so this is something, given that we have about 300 to 400,000 folks in Iowa, we don't even really know the population of well drinkers. How many people in here are on a well? Okay, good. All right. But it's a population we sort of struggle to engage with, to define, to identify, and I think we're constantly trying to work on that. So this has already been covered, and that green is going to be very vibrant on the screen, but there's about 15 million US households, so 15% of Americans that are on private wells, and it's always been sort of shocking to me that if you go to the EPA website, they tell you you are on your own. If you're on a municipal system, if you get water from a city, there's somebody there making sure that when you turn on the tap in the morning, that water has been checked and tested and treated to make sure it's safe. If you have a private well, you don't have that protection, and that can be a real challenge. So Chuck mentioned some of our platforms, we do data work, and because the state of Iowa has a lot of good data, but we just don't make it available or accessible to people. And so this is our well forecasting system, and this was our first effort to get private well data available to end users, anybody. And so this actually came out of a collaboration with the Geologic Survey, when they get a lot of requests saying, hey, we're going to drill a new well. Where do we need to drill to reach a certain aquifer depth? And so these enterprising individuals, my former colleague Ibrahim Demir, who recently left Iowa for Tulane, they built a system that will sort of predict where the different aquifers are located at a particular point. It's really cool. If you like that sort of thing, check it out. But more importantly, if you drop a pin, you can also turn on the water quality data, and it'll tell you what test results we have adjacent to where you're looking. And this was where we could get all that nitrate data, the bacteria data, and arsenic, if we have it. Because arsenic we've really only begun recently testing for in private wells back to 2016, where a lot of this other data goes back a lot longer ways. We're trying to build on this. I think that we'd be foolish to not think about how climate change will impact well users in the northwest portions of the state that can get very dry and extended periods of drought. Shallow wells, we have lots of Iowans that use shallow wells, they'll dry up. And so we were trying to do simple things like, what if we took our private well data and we just visualized it with things like the drought monitor? So we know where we might have wells to prioritize resources if we're worried about wells drying up. But maybe equally or even more so important is there's lots of places where we have private wells in floodplains. And so this is a pretty aggressive flood. This is a 500-year flood, and this is on the western half of the state. But you see that in a 500-year flood, there'd be a good number of wells that get inundated, and you can find these locations all over the state. And so I would argue that some of these wells, maybe historically, that show up in flood zones or floodplains in Iowa have previously been inundated. Those would be ones we want to prioritize for bacterial testing, and others because there's vulnerabilities for if the well were to become impaired or if there were infiltration in and degrading the water quality. We did, and I only bring this up because it sort of sets the stage for some of the research we've been doing. Back in 2019, so this predates any of the stuff you just heard, and I want to emphasize that because we worked with the Iowa HHS to get access to data on who was actually spending their private well grant. It used to be called the Grants to Counties program. Now it's called the Private Well Grants program. You just heard about it, where every year counties get about $40,000. If counties aren't spending, counties can get their reallocation and get more. And so we were trying, a colleague of mine, Sylvia Secchi, we wrote this simple brief just trying to see who was using their money. And since we're focusing on Northeast Iowa has usually been heavily engaged in spending all their money. So if you're in green, those are the counties that were spending anywhere from, I think that says 90 to 110% of their funds. And we'll talk about why that is, but Northeast Iowa has long understood that their wells are vulnerable and the counties have been aggressive. The downside is that unfortunately Dubuque County has a bit of a rough history where they weren't using their funds at the time. This is under prior leadership. It's great to see that this has been corrected, but Dubuque was one that we actually called out with some of the lowest levels of expenditures historically. And I only bring this up as I'm going to spend the first portion of my talk talking about data analysis we did from 2016 to 2020, and unfortunately, using that database, there's not a lot of Dubuque County data in it. So you're going to hear us talk about vulnerabilities in private wells in Northeast Iowa, but none of that's really going to pertain to Dubuque because they just weren't testing. And so it's a huge kudos to what they're doing now. Nothing made me more pleased than to see how much the script has been flipped here. And that is a testament. I know Chuck has been working hard on that. The county has really embraced it, so that's awesome. Okay, so that idea of why Northeast Iowa cares about their well water quality, how many of you have heard of karst? Yeah, okay. So you have a particular type of landform here that's really vulnerable to letting infiltration happen. And so this is sort of classic textbook language from the USGS. It's created from the dissolution of soluble rocks, principally limestone and dolomite. You have these distinctive landforms where you have springs, caves, and sinkholes, and the results the aquifers are highly productive but extremely vulnerable to contamination. So in areas that have this karst, things that happen on land have a greater probability of impacting what's happening below land because the water can move. And so we've often in Iowa focused in Northeast Iowa on private wells because they are our most vulnerable in the state. They just are. This is where we have the karst landforms. And it was in this, other states have these same vulnerabilities, and so you may be aware that the state of Minnesota had a group led by some advocacy organizations that petitioned the EPA to do something about private well contamination. And if you hear everybody talk about private wells, they'll say they're not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and that is correct. But there are some provisions in the Safe Drinking Water Act that allow for protections of aquifers, like the actual groundwater underneath, if it's used or has the potential to be used as a drinking water supply. So the very creative folks in Minnesota said, well, we're going to petition the EPA to say the state of Minnesota is not doing their job protecting the aquifer as a current and future source. And in that way, it doesn't matter if it's a municipal supply or a private well supply. There's language that says it needs to be protected. And so the EPA did come back and say the state needs to do more. And so Minnesota is trying to tackle this, although I'll admit I've lost track of where they're at in addressing this because they were trying to go through the legislative process. And even in Minnesota, the legislative process around nitrate contamination got kind of quagmired. You should know that groups in Iowa tried to do the same thing. They said, hey, if Minnesota's got problems, we have problems. And so they wrote a petition the same way to the EPA, and this went in at the end of 2024, and I bet you all understand what happened in between the end of 2024 and where we sit today. And this is one of those petitions to the EPA that is just sort of fluttered into the ether. I don't know that we're going to hear much about it. EPA Region 7 was considering it. I think they were trying to act on it before the change of administration. I don't suspect we'll ever hear the outcome of this, and if we do, I doubt the outcome will be favorable to try to drive more protections on aquifers here in Iowa. But groups were trying. Okay, so let's talk about nitrate then. Well, we heard that nitrate is the thing that tends to drive it, a lot of this action. And so I want to give you all a brief refresher on nitrate and sort of its sister nitrite as to why we worry about it in drinking water. So the US EPA first promulgated an interim primary drinking water regulation for nitrate and nitrate back in 1975. This is effectively when the Safe Drinking Water Act was established. So one of the first things the Safe Drinking Water Act went after was nitrate, which I'm assuming I don't have to tell this group, a lot of it comes into our waterways through runoff from agricultural activities. There are other sources. Wastewater treatment plants will discharge it. Septic systems will leach it. But the majority of our problems comes from the fact that we put down a lot of anhydrous ammonia onto our land, we put down a lot of manure onto our land, and while those are in forms of nitrate or nitrogen that we say are reduced, like ammonia, over time they transform into nitrate, and that's what ends up in our waterways. I think everybody that cares about water in Iowa knows this by heart. It's 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen for nitrate, and 1 milligram per liter as nitrogen for nitrite. One of these days I'm going to remember to fix that, because I remind myself of the typo every time I show this slide. And then these were finalized in 1990. And when the EPA sets a regulation, I'm going to give you a little bit of a policy primer. The first thing they have to do is set a public health goal. And the public health goal basically says, if I had all the money in the world, all the technology in the world, this is like the blue sky scenario. If there were no limits, how much of these things would I want in my water? They set that number, and then they're required by law to enforce what we call the MCL, or the maximum contaminant level, and they have to set that MCL that's enforceable as close to the public health goal as possible. And so you'll notice that for nitrate and nitrite, the actual enforceable standard matches the public health goal. That in the eyes of the EPA, they feel like there's no better they can do. A good example of where those differ is anything that causes cancer. Anything that causes cancer, the public health goal is 0. Our policy says that anything that's a cancer-causing agent, we want none of it. We never want to be exposed to it. But you will never find 0 as an enforceable standard, because it's really not achievable. It takes too much money. It takes technology that probably doesn't exist. But I point this out because in the eyes of the EPA, they're basically saying we can do no better. And what we end up regulating nitrate for, as many in this audience probably know, is this idea of blue baby syndrome. Is that if you ingest nitrate, it actually gets reduced to nitrite in our body. That's why nitrite is also regulated. Nitrite can interfere with how oxygen is transported by hemoglobin. And so in young infants in particular, they will essentially be deprived of oxygen if they're drinking formula prepared with high nitrate water. That's methemoglobinemia. And it's commonly referred to as blue baby syndrome because the baby will suffocate, they will turn blue. And in extreme cases, it can be fatal. The problem with nitrate is that the data hasn't stopped being collected, that even though the standard was set for blue baby syndrome, there's been a lot of recent data that shows that there might be, that's an acute effect, blue baby syndrome. And what I mean by that is if a baby is drinking that water today, they're sick immediately, acute, fast. There's concern that nitrate also has chronic toxicity, and so that means over long periods of exposure time, now years. If we keep drinking high levels of nitrate in water, we could have health effects that aren't accounted for in that standard. And this is from that nitrate being reduced to nitrite. And we know that this happens just because there's lots of dietary sources like vegetables or bacon where you can get nitrite and nitrate. And then the nitrite works its way into your gut. And nitrite is actually able in the gut to reduce or to react with a lot of things that we find in protein like amines and amides. And they form something called N-nitroso compounds. And we know that N-nitroso compounds are carcinogenic. They cause cancer. So if you've heard about potential leaks of nitrate to cancer, this is the plausible mechanism, and this is why this is such a concern, is it's not just associations of nitrate in drinking water with a health outcome from, say, epidemiological studies. There is a presumed mechanism, and it's that you're forming these N-nitroso compounds in our gut that go on to cause DNA mutations that lead to cancer. I want you to put a pin in this, because I'm going to come back to this close to the end, and I'll tell you where these are things that I worry about. The folks at Cheek, the prior director, did a lot of work on this. They published a review. The issue with these long-term chronic health effects is that it links to things like colorectal cancer, thyroid disease, birth defects. And in this summary of the literature led by, Pete Wire, that's the former director at Cheek, many studies observed these increased risks with ingestion of water nitrate levels that were below the regulatory limits. So less than 10. This is the concern with nitrate. Is the Safe Drinking Water Act standard health protective enough? Because it accounts for acute blue baby syndrome, it doesn't currently capture anything with chronic health impacts like cancer. Remember, that public health goal for nitrate is the same as what we enforce. In EPA's minds, we're doing as good as we can when there's a lot of recent science that says there may be more there that the standard isn't capturing. And if you're wondering how far below the standard, this is the work that was done out of Cheek by Pete Wire with partners from the National Cancer Institute. Increased risks of bladder cancer, ovarian cancer, thyroid cancer at levels greater than 3 to 5 milligrams per liter. Again, the standard's 10. When they were finding folks that were drinking that water anywhere from 4 to 11 years. And then you can see the intakes for during pregnancy for links to birth defects, but the point being the same. Levels below the standard that are being associated with adverse health outcomes. Now, it's hard to conceptualize what an increase in risk like this means. There was a recent study that looked at colorectal cancer, which is another cancer that people have associated nitrate with, and said that in Iowa, based on the levels that we have, it could be anywhere from 70 to 300 additional cases of colorectal cancer a year that could come from nitrate in drinking water. Now, that is not enough additional cases to sort of close the gap in excess that we have, because we know we're number 2 in cancer in Iowa, but it is more that maybe shouldn't be there if in fact nitrate is causing this problem. And I will say the science, while it can be pretty compelling, has not been enough to shift a standard. And so that's why we're sort of caught where we are today with lots of people in Iowa drinking levels of nitrate that science might say is unsafe, but that the standard and the regulations for drinking water are saying is acceptable. One myth I want to dispel based off work we've done in Northeast Iowa, because now I want to shift a little bit to the work we've done here, is a lot of people will say, well, you don't get enough nitrate through drinking water. Most of the standards are built off of thinking dietary intake, right? If you're eating that meat or if you're eating those vegetables. But this was a study that was done with private well users that basically found that in these instances, if you're drinking water that's close to 10 milligrams per liter, which is that EPA standard, it can make up as much as 44% as the median for your daily nitrate intake. And so this is actually, they were measuring essentially nitrate in urine as a measure of what people were being exposed to and correlating that to surveys of their diet and then what was in their water quality. And basically just saying, yes, water can be an important source. At the levels when it's high and close to 10, and we have lots of folks in Iowa on private wells or otherwise that see that type of water, it is contributing to your total intake. And I mentioned that this has been every day I get asked, because the Cancer Registry at the University of Iowa has found that Iowa has the second highest rate of age-adjusted new cancers, and we're one of only 2 states that have a rising age-adjusted rate of new cancers. We only trail Kentucky. In Kentucky, everybody associates this to smoking and coal mining and lots of the other sorts of things that are going on there that make Kentucky unique. Many people want to know what's making Iowa unique enough to be second, and in this unfortunate company of one of just 2 states that's rising, and we've been rising year on year. So when it comes to private wells, Iowa is better than most of trying to understand what nitrate exposure people get. With that testing program, there is what the DNR calls the private well tracking system. And this is a database that maintains all of that testing data from the minute they started collecting samples. So we should be able to mine this to get a sense of who's drinking what and where, and why might certain groups be vulnerable, because in this database, the county health specialists that collect this data collect a bunch of other things. They will have characteristics of the well, like the age and the depth. They'll have what's close to it, septic systems, row crops, animal operations. They'll have a bunch of other information that we can try to correlate. But I want to just say one quick word, is that, and why this takes time. When we went and we looked at the historical private well tracking system data, this is what we saw. And I've got a PhD, but it does not take a PhD to tell you that there's something wrong here, right? Like, this is data from 2000 to about 2025, and something in about 2014 to 2015 just blew up. And basically what we found is there was all sorts of systematic data entry errors in this database. So one lesson of working with data is it's only good if it's high quality, otherwise it's garbage. So I gave up way too much time working with my colleague Alex Sikowski to try to fix this. How do you fix it? The state hygienics lab in the state runs most of these tests. So we asked them for their original files, and then we went back and we painstakingly matched original test data to results. And I'm proud to share that we made a pretty big dent. We haven't fixed anything, but let's have a quick word on nitrate. There's a lot of instances in papers and other ways where you'll see folks talking about nitrate levels like 400, like you see these points. I would tell you I would bet good money that anything above 100 in here is wrong. There's all sorts of reasons why data gets entered wrong for nitrate. I don't need to get into the weeds of it, but you hear about that 10 milligrams per liter is N. There's another way you can report it that's not as N, and everybody mixes it up. And that's how you get a data that's here being way up here. So the stuff you want to be looking at is really down here, but this is a far cleaner data set. So I only tell you this to say that the data we're working with is this cleaned version so you can trust it. Unfortunately, the DNR doesn't have access to this. There's no way for them to get access to this, so we're the only ones that are working with this clean data. How have we used that data? Well, we looked at 20 counties, generously called Northeast. Some of it's Eastern, some of it's Eastern Central. We work with the Geologic Survey, Rick Langle. We work with Marty Sinclair's with me at Cheek and IHR, and Darren Thompson's my associate director. And we wanted to just ask this question: can we use this data to identify factors that make wells in Northeast Iowa susceptible to high nitrate? What makes this also unique is, in addition to having that clean data, like Rick Langle is a bit of a genius and sits there and took about 3,200 data points and for those wells matched them to the aquifer that the water was coming from. That's not information that's in the private well tracking system. That's information that he painstakingly put in, and if you could read the different aquifers there, you can see the different colors, because the wells go deep. And some go deeper than others, and they all tap into different water below ground, and so we wanted to account for that. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some data that's the state's data, looking at these counties, and yes, this is Dubuque, and this is what I mean when we basically just didn't include it. There was a handful of data at the time, and it wouldn't have made much sense from a statistical analysis. If it's blue, we're calling it safe, is less than 5. If it's yellow, we're calling it caution because it's above 5 but below 10, and that's where science is saying that there might be some worries. If it's red, it's going to be unsafe. And so this was all wells from 2016 to 2020. This is the subset of 3,200 that had reliable depth information, and these numbers are the percents that are above 10. So the numbers that are on there with the N beneath it is the N is the total number of wells that we had depth for in that county. The percentage is the percent above 10. And so yes, you're reading right that in Delaware County, 24% of the wells in this period were above 10 milligrams per liter. So 1 in 4 wells in Delaware County were unsafe. There were at least, there were 6 counties with at least 10% of their tests above 10 milligrams per liter: Black Hawk, Delaware, Jones, Jackson, Clinton, and Cedar. And you might be saying 10%, is that a lot? I guarantee you if 10% of public water systems in Iowa were in violation of the nitrate standard, we would be leading the national news every night. On average, it's like a couple of percents of water systems that have violations in a year. This would be a national travesty. And we let it happen in private wells. In some instances, 1 in 4 private wells in Delaware County. That's not okay. I was trying to do my math. I think you said it was about 25 of the 250 or so you tested up. Because I would love to know where Dubuque sits in, but it sounds like you all might be somewhere around 10, but it's something we're thinking about. But you also see differences in testing, right? There were other counties, like we didn't have a lot of data in some of these counties, and that's not saying there wasn't testing there, but that we couldn't just match well depth. So remember, the numbers you're seeing are where we were able to match depth. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you is we did a statistical analysis. We took all that other data on the wells that we had that was in the database, and we tried to identify factors that make a well vulnerable, and I'm going to show you a lot of these types of things that are called box and whisker plots. And so when you see these boxes, what I'm telling you here is this bar is the maximum value that's reported in the data set. This bar down here is the minimum. This triangle or diamond is going to be the mean or the average value. So if you know averages, that's all the mean is. The median is the data where half the amount is beneath it and half the amount is above it. So the median and the mean aren't the same, right? Mean is the average, median's the midpoint. And then just if you're interested, the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. So this first and third quartile is just kind of where's the majority of the data sitting. This will make sense in a second. Okay, so the question. Having a well in the drift list, does that make you more vulnerable to high levels of nitrate? And the data would say, well, yes, because our median and mean are significantly higher than other places that we've defined as just the normal Iowan surface. And you can arm wrestle me over the drift list designation. But these are the ones we've lumped into drift list. And you see how much higher the maximum values can go. So the data would show, and again, all these graphs are going to show 5 and 10. This would say that if you're in the drift list, you have a higher chance or a greater probability of having higher levels of nitrate just based on the data we have. Okay. How about karst? So this isn't surprising. In fact, a lot of these results aren't surprising, but it's nice that the data supports it. If you are close to karst, or if your well is situated in an area that is designated as karst, so this is the distance to karst, so this is you're in a karst feature based on the maps that we have, or you're 100 feet from it, 500 feet from it, 1,000 feet from it, or greater than 1,000 feet from it. Look, if you're near karst, it's clear and it's obvious. That makes you vulnerable, but yet we've got wells. So I would argue these are the wells we need to be thinking about in terms of prioritizing for testing and intervention, because they can have high values of nitrate. I want to remind you that a lot of this data is single point measurements. We might have one measurement over the 4-year period. Like, we don't do enough of testing and retesting or understanding seasonality. All that stuff matters. We'll keep trying to dig into things like seasonality with the data set. Delaware County is just a massive outlier. Anybody here from Delaware County? No one drove in from Delaware. We can do this on the road in Delaware then maybe next time, Chuck, because if you're in Delaware County, you just stand out, like just massively. There's what were other counties, I don't have the list, but what we've sort of deemed as Northeast, East Central, North Central, and then we've just pulled out Delaware, because Delaware was skewing all of our analysis because it's just high. I mean, look at the average value in Delaware is above 5. It's in that caution area. And you get values that are maximums that are off my graph, right? There's a problem in Delaware County. We need to figure that one out. And this is busy, but this is now, I mentioned we assigned all the aquifers. There's a lot you can take away from this, but I'll say on average, shallow wells, like the alluvial wells, so alluvials are the ones that are really shallow, connected to the river systems, those are higher. And then if you're in Delaware County, the Macokota wells, the Silurian wells, and then those crazy, you are at risk being on an alluvial well in Delaware County. You are making a choice, right? And I'm happy to share these with anybody, like especially folks from the county. What else? And some of this is obvious. Well depth. Shallow wells are more vulnerable. So we just saw that alluvial wells are vulnerable. Now if we have well depths that are in PWTS and depth to bedrock, like depth to bedrock, these are shallower wells, more vulnerability than less shallow. Whenever you see these values divided up into, say, 4, like how did we come up with 156, 157 to 212, 213 to 320, and greater than 321? Those are just quartiles. So 25% of the data, the next 25%, the next 20. So those are just letting the data sort of self-separate that way into quartiles. But again, none of this is probably terribly earth-shattering. I mean, some of the Delaware County stuff is. But we would expect to see this, and we're seeing it. Fecal coliform, so that's E. coli. It turns out that if you have E. coli contamination, you have a greater probability of having nitrate contamination. And maybe that makes sense, but it's good to see it. So for nitrate data that had no detection of fecal coliform, this is the range of data we see. So you can certainly have nitrate without fecal coliform. If you have a value of 1, so your test just produces 1 colony that you can grow in your test, a little bit lower. If it's more than 1, so you got a lot of fecal coliform, you have a lot of nitrate. So it's a double whammy. You're not just going to have nitrate contamination, you're going to have bacterial contamination, and bacterial contamination that can cause gastrointestinal distress. So there's a few other variables, and I think some of these are helpful. Like, so what else? It varies depending on if you're just looking at wells that are above 10, so above the standard, or wells that are above 5, in that 5 to 10 range. It turns out one of the best things you can do is cover your wellhead. A simple intervention. If your wellhead is covered, your if it's uncovered, that should probably say you're much more likely to be above 10. But it's that simple act of covering or uncovering your wellhead means you're much more likely to have 5 or 10. If you are above 5, another variable that popped out is your proximity to livestock. And so this is something we're digging more into, that if your well is within 100 feet of a livestock operation, as noted in the private well tracking system, greater propensity of being above 5. So that leads to the question of like, what is different about Delaware County? You could do these comparisons with every county, but one thing that's interesting is you notice Allen-McKee right up here has about the same magnitude of tests, right? 363 to 484. They both have about the same amount of confining layer, which is like the protective layer above. So there's very similar geology, but Allen-McKee has a lot less of their wells close to row crop and a lot less animal units. And so when we think about what makes Delaware County vulnerable, we're zeroing in on some of those ag operations. And we do see that nitrate concentrations in counties do scale or do correlate with total animal units. It's tricky because a lot of this gets skewed by how many animals are actually in Delaware County. And so these are alphabetical order, but you see that 178,000 animal units in Delaware. So we're continuing to dig in. But likely, someone asked earlier at my earlier presentation, what makes Delaware County bad? It's this unfortunate combination of shallow wells, vulnerabilities in the landform, row crop, animal units, proximity to livestock. It's the combination. And I just want to say, a lot of this is consistent with what we've seen in other studies. Southwest Wisconsin was a study led by out of the USGS, and very similar things in terms of what makes wells vulnerable to nitrate, coliforms, human wastewater, livestock manure. So everything we're seeing, it makes intuitive sense, and it's nice that the data set shows it because we'd expect it. And it does zero in, like Delaware County needs a lot of assistance. They just are going to. What about contaminants other than nitrate? How are we doing on time? Okay. He's giving me a thumbs up. He's the man in charge. So we've done other things, and this actually is all Dubuque data now. So working with the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Dubuque, and that's the man in the back, Adam Hoffman, we wanted to take like a broad spectrum look. One of the things I'll say a lot is like the focus on nitrate in Iowa, it's right and appropriate, but it like suffocates, it takes all the oxygen out of the room. We don't get a chance to talk about our other vulnerabilities. So in this study, we did something different. So in Dubuque County, there's something like, I think there's maybe, I should know the number. There's about 15, let's say, public water systems. And so there's all these different water systems that are supplying water to a service area. We wanted to test those and then private wells just outside of their service area to kind of look at what the geographical disparity is. Like if you live a mile beyond the service area, what does that mean for the type of water you're getting? We were not trying to match the aquifer that they're drawing from, because you would expect if you were pulling from the same aquifer it'd be the same. We just wanted to say like, hey, if I'm on a supply here and then my neighbor down there a couple blocks away is on a private well, what's the disparity in exposure that they're getting? And then we look for a lot of things. So what did we look at? These are all Safe Drinking Water Act regulated contaminants. On this graph, red is the Safe Drinking Water Act standard. These are box and whisker plots like I showed you before, but all the individual data is shown over it. For the regulated contaminants, I mean, the thing to look at is nitrate, right? Most of the well data is greater than municipal data, and some of the well data was even in violation of 10. Otherwise, just about every other thing that's regulated that we measured, the water, like both the wells and the water systems are comparable and well below the standard. So that tells us that outside of nitrate, there's a lot of similarity, or reasonable enough similarity in terms of health protectiveness for what a well is drinking and what a municipal water system is drinking. I will point out that lead, like we tend to think lead's only an issue on municipal water systems. That's absolutely not true. You could even convince yourself that the lead values in private wells are slightly greater, because we have a lot of lead in plumbing in the home. We have a lot of lead in the casings on the wells. We need to think about testing private wells for lead. What about secondary regulated contaminants? A lot of folks don't appreciate that the US EPA also regulates. These aren't enforceable standards, but they're essentially recommendations the EPA makes so your water tastes good, smells good, looks good. And so that's why these secondary standards have things like iron, because if there's too much iron, it'll be brown. Or manganese was mentioned. We actually have it on the secondary list because it can stain your white linens, but we are focusing on this one more and more because there are some health effects. You notice that wells can have a bit more iron, including above that standard, and a lot more manganese. And so this is one of those ones that's an emerging threat where the EPA has looked to regulate it, and wells are definitely more vulnerable than municipal supplies. And this is likely just a difference between municipal systems drawing from groundwater that's deeper and shallower wells for private use that might be more vulnerable to manganese. And again, manganese is something that the EPA has put a health advisory out for. These are the health advisory levels. It's not very common in water systems, but we do see it around some in Iowa. Too much ingestion of manganese in your drinking water, it's believed to have effects and lead to things like neurodegeneration. There's manganism is like a Parkinson's type disease that you can get if you're exposed to too much manganese. But we primarily worry about manganese inhalation through proximity to smelters or other places that could be emitting it. And then we actually looked at a variety of non-regulated chemicals, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next few slides. Probably the things that are of note here is, this one's interesting, is lithium. This is one where the municipal systems are far more vulnerable than wells, because at depth, where municipal systems pull their water, there's more lithium. We have lithium in the deep groundwater in northeast Iowa. And so the EPA is considering regulating lithium, and that'll be a real challenge for municipal systems here. The other one where municipal systems are high is phosphorus, but that's mostly just because these systems are adding phosphorus for corrosion protection. If we add phosphorus intentionally to drinking water to coat the pipes and prevent lead from leaching out. And so you do see, and again, the blue are where there are known health advisories. And so these municipalities will be in trouble if the EPA sets a strict lithium standard. Lithium's a fun one. In communities that have low levels of lithium, there's actually benefits like reduced suicide mortality. Because remember, lithium is something that gets prescribed for neurological benefit. At high levels, though, it can be problematic. And so this is more just saying, there are some challenges that municipalities have that well users don't. The other thing that we focused on, this is where the University of Pitt researchers came in, is we looked at pathogens that are kind of emerging. And so a focus in the research community is what we call drinking water pathogens that predominantly cause infection in immunocompromised individuals, or DWPIs. It's a mouthful, but generally, folks that are immunocompromised are more vulnerable to getting sick from contaminated drinking water, and that should make some intuitive sense. And we know that there's a lot of bacteria and pathogens in the distribution system in drinking water that we don't completely remove with disinfection. And so there have been studies that would say things like Legionella pneumophila, and we've had Legionella outbreaks in Marshalltown, and this non-tuberculosis mycobacterium, they can contribute significantly to morbidity and mortality. And so we looked for those, and we used a technique that just looks for genetic, pieces of DNA of these materials. It's called qPCR. So it's instructive to say that you do see these types of emerging pathogens both in municipal and well water. You can try to compare their abundance based on how much we detect, but I'll admit that where we're struggling is to tie these numbers to the adverse health outcomes, right? This is simply an analytical tool that tells us these things are there, and you see that Legionella pneumophila, you see it in the municipal water system, which is interesting because they disinfect, but you do see it in well water. Same with that NTM, and not surprisingly, total bacteria is higher in wells because they don't get disinfected. But still, you have, this might be a little bit of you find what you look for, and we've got really good analytical tools. But you should know that there's emerging bacterial threats that we need to be microbial threats that we need to be paying attention to. And this is probably more than you need to see, but we did, on the analysis, looked at the whole community of microbes that were there, and they're distinct. One of the things I thought was really fascinating is we saw a bunch of things that are involved with the nitrogen cycle in well water, and I would guess that all that application of anhydrous and everything else that we put on the land is basically just kind of it's a stressor on the population of microbes that we're actually seeing that show up in our water system, our private wells. We've done a few other things, and I know I'm kind of running along, so I want to wrap up. This was not yet published, so I share this, like, just similar sort of thing. We're using these genetic targets to look for other types of pathogenous bacteria, like Shigella, or pathogenic strains of E. coli. And granted, we were taking, to see these things, you need larger volumes of water. Like, we were analyzing essentially 5 liters of water, where the standard private well test will be only like about 100 milliliters of water. But you do see evidence of these other pathogenic strains in wells. These were all taken from northeast Iowa. So 102 well water samples, and say like about 40 of them had detectable genetic evidence of Shigella. So we know these wells have had either current or prior microbial contamination. The question now is to turn this into what does it mean for public health? And this is a challenge we have with this study, admittedly, is when we use advanced analytical tools, what are the public health consequences of this, and how do we communicate it to people? We did look at antibiotic resistance, and just to say that a lot of the bacteria we were able to isolate at large volumes were resistant to things like azithromycin, tetracycline, and sulfamethoxazole. So this is something we need to be worried about when it comes to microbial contamination in wells. And then the last thing I'll say is, that's the microbes. I want to emphasize that we're getting really good analytically where we can see a lot of things. And normally how we look for stuff is we say, I'm going to measure lead, and I'm going to develop a method and go look for lead. Right now, the state of science is we're going to say, well, now we're not going to look for anything. We're just going to run a sample on an instrument and then use essentially like machine learning and big data to tell us everything that's there. That is a process that's called non-target analysis. And then it helps us with the new concept that's emerging is the exposome, everything we get exposed to in our daily lives. So we were really interested in looking at the chemistry like from an exposome perspective, because it sounds important, but it actually really is. I mean, the bottom line is what I'm trying to tell you is if we look at this, so that's that non-target analysis. You see a variety of signatures of other things in both municipal and well water. And I know that's really tiny, but some of the takeaways that jumped out at me, granted these are low levels, but we see atrazine and degradates of atrazine in every water sample that we took in that study across Dubuque County. Again, low levels, but it's there. Because we've historically used a bunch of atrazine, a corn herbicide. We see insecticides like neonicotinoids and their degradation products because we use a lot of them. So these ones that have high red values are ones that we detected a lot across both municipal and well water. And I'm here to tell you that this is what advances in analytical chemistry will do for us, is we're gonna know a lot more, and it complicates the discussion. And so you might be saying, Dave, why does this matter? Why does it matter if we have low levels of these things? And I told you to put a pin in those N-nitroso compounds. Well, let's go back to that. This study came out of Nebraska. Nebraska is light years ahead of us when it comes to thinking about health effects of nitrate and pesticides in their well water. And it's this study that was looking at links between nitrate, atrazine, and what they're calling other nitrosatable agrochemicals with birth defects in groundwater. So links between birth defects and then a combination of chemicals, not just nitrate, but nitrate with atrazine and other chemicals like atrazine. You might be saying, well, what's the trick about nitrate and atrazine? Because we know that atrazine, when you ingest it with nitrate, the nitrate gets transformed to nitrite, we talked about that, and then it goes into our gut, which is acidic, that's low pH, and people have shown that nitrite can react with atrazine to form N-nitrosoatrazine, one of those N-nitroso compounds. So now the nitrite is not reacting with the proteins in our body, it's reacting with the other chemicals that are in there that we co-digest with it, and people have shown that this is a cancer-causing substance. It has mutagenic, teratogenic, so it's linked, it could cause cancer and birth defects. And this study goes on to show a long list of chemicals like atrazine that can undergo this same reaction to form N-nitroso compounds. So why do we take a big picture lens to look at things that are unregulated and emerging? Because I don't think we fully anticipate the complexities of what's happening to these chemicals in our body to generate things that could be problematic. Which is why if people are looking for simple associations between nitrate ingestion and cancer, I'm going to tell you that's really hard, because you're not just getting exposed to nitrate. And that doesn't even account for the fact that there's lifestyle factors, genetic factors, any number of things that overlay on top of this. And so that's what they concluded. You see more likely effects through combinations of nitrate with these other things, not just individually. So, to wrap up, and hopefully I have time for questions, is it safe to drink from private wells in Northeast Iowa? That was the title, and Chuck helped me with the title. And first, I would just like to say that when it comes to safe and drinking water, we throw that around, but it means acceptable risk. There is no such thing as risk-free water. It's that idea of a public health goal, and then setting a standard as close to that public health goal. The difference between the goal and where we set that enforceable standard is what we deem acceptable. And usually for cancer, it's like a 1 in a million increased risk. So just know, safe is a tricky term that I try not to use. When it comes to drinking water out of a tap for this municipality, it's acceptable. We know that certain well locations like Delaware County, proximity to karst, are more vulnerable than others. I can say that with certainty. Certain types of well, shallower, older, are more vulnerable than others. Factors like proximity to livestock and row crops are likely significant, but more work is needed and ongoing. Well owners need to be vigilant to more than just nitrate and bacteria, like for example, manganese. And that said, there are instances where municipal systems in Northeast Iowa will have their own unique set of challenges, and that's that lithium question. With improving analytical tools, we know there is a lot more in our drinking water, but what does it mean for public health? That's those genetic measurements, that's those mixture measurements. Contaminant mixtures and chemicals generated through transformation or degradation of known contaminants merit further study. That's that nitrosatable compound. We didn't talk about PFAS, but it's going to be a significant challenge for private well consumers across Iowa, including Northeast Iowa. So you can have me back and I can make you feel all bad about PFAS chemicals, because I think I always tell people the story for PFAS in Iowa, we're far closer to the beginning of it than the end of it. And then last but not least, your head's probably spinning after everything. And so what I would just say is, we have more than enough evidence to act and better protect our water resources in Iowa. We cannot and we should not wait for a smoking gun on linked adverse health effects. We'll be waiting forever. The day is never gonna come where we know A causes B. We should be saying we know enough evidence that the way we're using our land, the chemicals that are in our water, it doesn't have to be this way. It's putting us at undue risk. We should act to lower that risk. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to use as much time as you'll give me for questions. Thanks, Chuck.
Is this still on? Yes, it is. I'm going to give one of these to Casey. She can handle this side of the room, and I'll handle the other side of the room. And so we can have your questions recorded. This is going to be saved forever in the cloud, as long as the cloud exists.
What could go wrong?
Your presentation reminded me of two things about legislation I introduced. That you're free to contact your own legislators and ask them to do the same after you hear about this. One was to require every public water system in the state to have a source water protection plan in place.
Yep.
You might be surprised to hear that there's no requirement that every utility be looking at its source and figuring out what are the threats to it and what are they doing to manage those threats to make sure the water's there and safe or as risk-free as possible in the future. The other one, even more simple, I thought, than that was, if you live in a rural area and have a private septic system, if you want to sell your house, you have to have that septic system inspected so that any problems with it are dealt with. We have no such requirements for a private well. So you'd think that it wouldn't be a hard lift to require private wells to be tested upon sale to a new owner, at least for a buyer beware perspective, whether or not we made them fix the problem. So there's some really simple things that we aren't doing policy-wise that we could be doing that would help people with privates, and some of those septic systems are contaminating wells, by the way.
They absolutely are.
That would help private landowners to become more aware of their situation, that they would be accessing this kind of research. And by the way, what's the drinking water equivalent of a lot to chew on? You've given us a lot to chew on. Anybody have questions for Dr. Cwiertny?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It doesn't pertain to what you're exactly talking about, but I'm wondering, are they doing any studies, or has there been any data collected about the livestock situation in Northeast Iowa by Monona that has a lot of sinkholes in the area? and then you've got the trout stream of Bloody Run. And I know that's a big concern for a lot of people. I'm just wondering if they're doing any studies or, collection of data on that.
Sure. There are, from what I understand, from the sensor network the University of Iowa maintains and deploys, there's a couple sensors up near Bloody Run that are getting measurements of nitrate, and I believe those have been in close to when that operation started. And I know that there's been a few studies that have been done. I think the United States Geological Survey has done some monitoring up in that area. We have not, so I can't speak directly. But I do know there's been a lot of interest, and I also know there's some community groups that have worked to try to rally with well users in the area to do some testing, perhaps using the state lab, but we haven't done that directly.
Hold on now.
You need to, yeah, can you use the mics just so it gets online?
The Driftless Water Defenders out of Iowa City, and several members are here. That organization has taken the water permits, the legality of that, to court. So
yes,
there's a lot of really good things hopefully will happen soon. So those places may not be able to exist in the near future.
Yeah, so I'm aware that there was some court cases. I'll admit to not knowing the outcomes on the water use permits and the legality of them, and sort of this idea. And I know that DNR is looking at this idea of how they define like beneficial use that goes with the new permits. What I'll just say in regards to like the water defenders and other groups is we absolutely need more engaged citizenry on this. I was saying over dinner that this is the lull period in Iowa water quality because nitrates are down in Des Moines, and now the news isn't going to be screaming about it for several months. We need to figure out how to maintain enthusiasm to promote water quality from September to March, because we're going to go back into this cycle once the season begins again, and all the nitrate will go back up. And that's another reason I'm usually advocating for expanding the dialogue beyond nitrate. Our biggest impairment of surface waters in Iowa is not nitrate, it's bacteria. We could solve all of our nitrate problems and we still wouldn't be able to swim in our water because there'd be too much bacteria. And that's coming from sources that we need to be thinking about that are related to nitrogen, but but at the same time, we need to be able to focus on the nitrate issue in Des Moines and elsewhere, but also realize we have a lot of other vulnerabilities that merit conversation and improvement. And hopefully that can maintain people's energy and enthusiasm.
Question here.
So because we live in an ag situation here, we're living in a pork, corn, cow factory.
Yep.
And we're trying to drink water out of this factory here. How do you work with the ag? And I have friends that are farmers, and it's a really hard conversation.
So what I would say in regards to that is, let's see if I can connect these two things together. We have farmers that we work with that are great. They are the ones that are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to do cover crops, conservation practices, and we have one farmer in particular that's basically given us free reign to do whatever we want on his farm. And we sample his drainage. We've done collections during his pesticide applications. So they're out there, and there are some that are eager to be engaged. I think the challenge remains that just like that farmer and those that are adopting conservation practices, it tends to be too few and far between, and that we need more folks that are open to that. Like we should be looking and where we can at drainage and understanding what's moving through that drainage and impacting groundwater and surface water. But to do that, we need more access. So that's a long way of saying is I think there are plenty of folks out there that are trying to do things differently and better, but not nearly enough. And the question here in Iowa is how do we close the gap between the folks that are doing it to the number of folks that need to be doing it so we can see meaningful change? And that's where we're stuck, because I tend to think the only way we're going to get there is through things like regulation, because we've tried all these other ways. And that just seems to be a bridge that neither party wants to do, right? So that's maybe not getting at how do you talk to the farmers? We will talk to anybody. We will talk to them very much. I will say that we've been having really good conversation from folks that are worried about occupational exposures, because one of the things we need to keep in mind about the second highest rates of cancer, if everybody wants to pin it on pesticides or this, that, or the other thing, if it's a pesticide burden, you'd expect those to be greatest in the farming community, because they're the ones that are exposed to it the most. So there's opportunities to try to think about engaging in ways that really centered on let's help you understand your vulnerabilities and then what it means for vulnerabilities moving off your land. I think folks will be responsive, but we also have to figure out how to turn that interest into meaningful change, and that's where, like I said, we're stuck in Iowa. Wait for the mic, but yes.
I want to thank you for that question you just asked. I just finished a book actually last night called Dakota County Incorporated.
Okay.
It talks about the factory farm situation in southern Minnesota, and surprisingly enough, the Iowa Farm Bureau comes up repeatedly in this book as it looks at the Iowa Farm Bureau as one of the major proponents of big ag and factory farms. I'm just wondering, when we're talking about farmers, we all have a vision of a 40-acre or 100-acre farm, and that's the farmers in Iowa that are doing major damage are the ones that have maybe 40 acres, but that 40 acres has, 100, 1,000 animal units on it, 2,000 animal units on it, or splits up animal units into, 6-acre spots and then puts 1,000 animal units there. Mm-hmm. What can we do to try to mitigate the problem with factory farms, big ag farms, the real farmers that are spoiling the water in Iowa for all of us?
Yeah.
And also not to get away from the myth of the idyllic farm we had. When we were talking about how do we balance those two types of farms and how do we get that message out?
Yeah, really, really easy questions this evening. There's not a lot that can, so where do I want to start? That type of production system with the confinement system, particularly as they can get spread out to sort of just come in under permits, that's a dirty system, right? And I don't think we've even fully characterized the full extent of environmental and public health challenges that come from it. I mean, we don't talk nearly enough about things like antibiotic resistance, asthma, the things that come from living in proximity to those farms, not to mention the quality of life and the mental health challenges that can come from having your community sort of upended with just everything, the odor, everything that comes from with it. I think the ability for communities to sort of have a say in what's happening in their backyard, that's been lost in Iowa. We need to figure out how to get that back, because you should have some say as to what operations go where and how it impacts your quality of life. And I think that begins with, if there's not going to be legislative change to add things like local control back into the decision-making process, then it needs to be groups that are trying to do everything they can to hold groups accountable so that when farms go in like that, there's not all these unintended and intended adverse consequences, right? Or unintended, but I should say expected adverse consequences. I don't have a good answer on how to do that, right? I think the flaws in things like the master matrix are pretty well documented. Chris Jones talks about those a lot. I don't disagree with a lot of that. I think communities should have a say on how they are able to push back when those types of facilities want to go in, and I think we've lost that, and we got to figure out how to get it back. If I had the answers, I'd be doing everything I can to share those answers. But to me, it's like the first bit is, so seriously, here's what I would say. This is great that you're here tonight, right? But we need more. And I'd also say look around, and we need younger, and we need more diverse. And we don't get that in Iowa. We just don't. We need to figure out how to broaden the coalition of folks who are saying this is enough, and there needs to be a different way. And we haven't cracked that nut. It's great to have a vocal, reliable contingent that's out all the time, but we need more. We need more. And I think as we start to grow more, people would respond to it. Politicians would run with these as issues that they'd want to get elected on. But until that moment happens, this is still going to be something that no one is eager to address, because we're going to keep leaning into the status quo, because that's working for a good number of people here that don't want to see it changed.
We have time for a couple more questions and see if we can get David in a little more trouble.
I was going to say, you're going to see if you can see if I can stick my foot in my mouth anymore, huh?
I have two questions, maybe unrelated, but I've always been interested in what the role rural water systems have in the state of Iowa. And talk about that a little, please, how that relates and why they're there. But the other one is, what happens when you do find a well that is, has contamination, whether it be bacterial or nitrogen? Is there anything that tries to figure out where that, what's causing that, so that you then have some data to be able to start saying, here's where it's coming from, here's what we can do here, and then maybe that gets expanded as each of the wells is addressed?
Yeah, two excellent questions. So on the first about rural water systems, I can't speak to how they started. I could give you the simple history of they just realized there were folks that needed connections, and for whatever reason, maybe the wells weren't reliable, and so they found hookups. What I would say is without any, it's an endorsement because I don't know them personally, we need to expand their role. I was just asked recently, what's my moonshot idea when it comes to private wells, like rural water access? And my moonshot idea, if I had all the resources and decision-making power in the world, is I'd get rid of every private well. And I know a lot of folks will say, we love our private well, it tastes great, I don't have to pay for anything. It's a vulnerability. If not now, in a changing climate, it could be. And there's a lot of things you're taking for granted, assuming that it's safe day in, day out, that we just don't have data to back it up. So if I could figure out a way to deliver water long distances at low cost without it degrading in quality, because those are the challenges for rural water, right? The hookups, the cost to hook up, water's heavy. And if you don't believe me, fill up 2 buckets and go up a flight of stairs. Water's heavy. So we got to be able to how to move it, and then how to keep the quality of it safe until it reaches those long distances. But I think things like consolidation and rural water are going to be really critical to get as many people off private wells as possible and having reliable drinking water. And I think things like perfluorinated chemicals are going to push a lot of that, because there's not going to be a lot of options for people with contaminated wells when it comes to things like PFAS. The idea of figuring out where the contamination's coming from, there's a few things you can do, but not a lot. One thing that's really popular is this idea of microbial source tracking. So if you find bacteria, the things we're doing, like the genes, I know I kind of glossed over that and it's pretty high level, but the tools are that such, we can look for specific genetic indicators of specific bacteria and other pathogens. You can do that for specific genes that are tied to different animal species. So, we've done this on creeks in northwest Iowa, on some of the beaches that get closed. You can actually trace the genetic signatures to particular species. And so that gets done a lot. And that might be able to tell you that that E. coli is, there, and then with it are a lot of genetic indicators of, say, swine. And then you might know that it's coming from swine manure that's being applied somewhere. It might tell you it's human, and that's the leaky septic. Because in Wisconsin, it was about 50% of the well contamination where they were doing source apportionment or source tracking tied back to humans. And so we tend to discount the role that septic systems play. Even though we didn't see septic systems in proximity to septics, if you trust the data in the PWTS as an important variable in our analysis at least. There are people trying to do the same thing with nitrogen, with nitrate, but it's harder. You can actually use isotopes. It's a pretty high-end approach, and it's not foolproof. The last bit is you look for other things with it. So one of the things we're exploring is looking for not just nitrate, but also caffeine. Because if you see caffeine, that's only coming from you and me drinking Coke and coffee and peeing it out into our septic. And so nitrate and caffeine might tell you that's coming from a septic system or a municipal waste. Or we could look for a pesticide. And if you see nitrate in a pesticide, maybe that's coming from ag runoff. And we have been looking at things like neonicotinoids, those insecticides, as things that move like nitrate, and looking for those correlations to do just that. So that's probably more than you wanted, but there are ways. And at best, it's just going to point you in a direction. It's not going to be definitive, because even that microbial stuff, just because I find genetic signature for a pig, doesn't mean that I've already lost the genetic signature for a human, right? It might have drifted away or broken down before I can measure it.
You just started to touch on the question that I was going to ask. Have there been correlation studies looking at concentration of nitrates with some of these farm chemicals? So in other words, can we assume if we have a low nitrate level that it's less likely that we're going to have the other agricultural chemicals?
It depends. It's an answer you don't want. A lot of that relates to, so nitrate is very mobile. It's soluble and it moves with water, which is why when it rains, because you'll hear when it rains, we get a lot of nitrate flushing off, right? So for chemicals that are land applied and move like nitrate, and those neonicotinoid insecticides that are on like seed treatments, they move like nitrate. So for some of them, we see really good correlations between high nitrate and high insecticides. But for things like atrazine or fungicides that are a little stickier and don't move like nitrate, it won't tell you much. So, so to some degree, yes. To some degree, no, unfortunately. But very excellent question, by the way. That was awesome. And in the back, if there's time for more, Chuck, I'm happy to, I'm good. I got an hour and a half drive, I'm here.
We're approaching the 1.5 hour mark. I don't know how much tape Nathan has there, but
If you have a private well, what aquifer is best to be in? How's that for the ending question?
So I'm not gonna name one because I don't know where you're located, but I would generally say it's always a choice. If you go shallow, your vulnerabilities are things that are land applied. So you could have nitrate, you could have bacteria, you could have pesticides in shallower aquifers and wells because they're much more likely to be exposed to whatever's happening on the land. If you go deeper, you could run into things that are like naturally occurring, like arsenic, manganese, uranium, radium, that are just there naturally. Nobody put it there but whoever created the planet. The right answer would probably be something with a really good confining layer, or if like a well driller can drill through, say, like a compact layer of clay or something that doesn't allow water to come in from above, is you can get to that protected aquifer that's not so deep. You're probably doing pretty well because you're going to have less of a chance of finding the deep problematic stuff that also will add taste and saltiness to your water, and you'll have some confining layer above it that's protective to prevent. But that's greatly simplifying things down. And there's probably other people in the room that could speak to it more eloquently than I could.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cwiertny.
Thank you. Those were excellent questions. A lot of fun.
I'm going to have one question of Allie White before we go, but I did want to say in your behalf, maybe not your behalf, but on behalf of Iowa's public university researchers in particular, I don't think any of us in the legislature thought it was the role of our scientists to figure out what the right thing to do with their research is. I do think there should be an expectation, however, that we do the right thing with your research. And I've said for a long time that some colleagues have a tendency to ignore what you do, and I think we wouldn't mind if sometimes you stood, I'm not speaking of you personally, to have the folks who know what they're talking about stand up for their research and make sure at least it's not misrepresented or ignored, and that we try to do the right thing with it, even though you don't necessarily have that in your back pocket. I always said the most important tool to promote personal hygiene is a mirror. And every morning I look into it, and the more we can get people to look at themselves and what they do, the more likely we'll be motivated to do something. And that's why I think testing our water on a regular basis can be a good thing. It will motivate people to act if they find that they need to act. So my question for Allie is, what can people in this room do to help you promote your program, but what are the opinion leaders that your department relies on doing or can do to work with the folks they represent to make sure they know about this program and participate in it? So we want to give the folks here an action item as they go.
I just think it needs to be part of our conversation, right? Word of mouth is probably the best way that we can help one another. I think you made an excellent point that this room is full, and that's great, but we can always have more. We can always do better. So just not shying away from talking about these things, and your friends, your family, your acquaintances, people you trust, they're gonna trust you. If you have a good experience with any of the services that we provide, then don't be afraid to share that. So thank you.
Has the Soil and Water Conservation District been a good partner in promoting this? Good to hear. I'd like to thank Dr. Cwiertny, Allie, Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Lawson, Nathan Rieperger, our filmmaker here. I see him all the time doing the basketball games, so I know he puts in a lot of late nights. Appreciate putting in one for us. And all the Land and Water Legacy folks who are here tonight. This is hopefully the start of this conversation, and we'd like to foster conversations about many other things that relate to our land and water resources that we need to think long and hard about doing a better job protecting and enjoying. So thanks for coming tonight. Sign up to be an ally so you find out what those next opportunities are.